to follow them. What we're going to be talking about is mostly tools of the trade. So these are the sort of pieces of equipment, right? Like the physical infrastructure that you can use to make sure that you're making a podcast that sounds the best that it can be. Let me turn on captions. Apologies about that. So yeah, I mean, let's just dive right in. So first of all, I thought I would start with a little bit of an introduction and maybe a justification for why I'm even here at all. Jeremy Bloom, fantastically credentialed person, knows far more about this stuff than I do. I only started with Raw Talk 2 years ago. I've been the lead audio engineer for a year, and for a year before that, I was working under Grace and a few other awesome folks, Richie as well, who were the sort of like original audio engineering team with Raw Talk, who taught me pretty much everything I know about recorded audio. Prior to that, I did have some experience in live theater with sound and mixing. So mostly everything that I did was on stage. This picture is unfortunately the only one that exists of me holding a microphone in front of a board. There's a stage in the background. I'm eating a cookie because that is how I was paid and continue to be paid to this day. I don't work for money, I just work for cookies. But the reason that I bring this up is on a note of humility, because I am sure that there are folks in the audience right now that likely have more experience, especially experience in audio engineering of podcasts. And so I'm really excited to chat with all of you. I hope that some other people can bring in their voices. I'm going to provide some tips, but these are by no means prescriptive, directions. There are lots of different ways to do this, and I suspect that I will learn something new by the end of today's talk. And so on that note, I would ask that if you're interested and if you have questions, to stick around after this session, immediately after, starting at 4:10. There is a workshop. There are a series of workshops on a bunch of different topics that are going to be led by different folks on Raw Talk. Me and one of the other audio engineers are going to be leading a session on audio engineering. So please feel free to stop by. I'm mostly going to reserve question time for that discussion after this is over, just because I only have 25 minutes. And turns out there's a lot of stuff to get through in the world of audio engineering. So specifically what we're going to be talking about today is mainly going to fall into two categories. The first is talking about recording voice. And I mean like the hardware, the actual nuts and bolts of recording dialogue, whether that's an interview between, a host and a guest. So Raw Talk is an interview podcast. So obviously we have a lot of experience in that, and that's where a lot of the sort of like case studies that I can talk about are coming from. We also do voiceover narration, right, to sort of contextualize and tell a story around the interviews that we make. But it doesn't even need to be all that, right? It just could be you and your friends talking online, right, getting together on a phone call and telling a story or discussing a topic, right? There's a huge market for podcasts that are just a couple of people sitting around and talking. So I'm hoping that the advice that I'm going to be discussing today is relevant to all those things, right? As long as it's sort of recording voice. I'm not really going to touch on sort of recording more complex things like music. I think Jeremy's talk this morning was really phenomenal in inspiring me and hopefully the rest of you to sort of like get out there and record sounds in your world. There's lots of different stuff, but today we're focusing mostly on voice. And then once we get past that sort of the section on hardware, we're going to talk a little bit about software for podcast editing. Richie sort of touched on the main points that I'll also be discussing in a little bit more detail. But yeah, that's kind of the overview for what we're going to be talking about today. So we'll get right on to talking about recording audio. So here there are sort of two main things to think about, right? The first is obviously microphones, right? Microphones, gear. I think that there's a real, desire when you're thinking about audio engineering to think about mics and like think about getting the best mic and the fanciest mic for your setup. I also love how the captions are going to say, when I say microphone, they think I'm talking about a guy named Mike, which I think is awesome. We can all imagine our microphones as a person named Mike. But there's something more than microphones, right? There's actually a lot of less fancy things that are kind of equally important in influencing the sound that you're going to produce. Your recording environment is kind of crucial when you're thinking about how your podcast is going to sound. So while there can be the impulse to focus on expensive things like fancy gear, cheap things like your environment can play a big role. So this is something that Jeremy talked about as well, but avoiding background noise is a huge help, right? Dealing with the quality of your audio signal when it comes in is going to be a huge help to you in the edit bay later when you're trying to figure out how to make your podcast sound good. Doing things like, I'm in a cold room, I have a heater right over there just off camera that I have turned off because we must all suffer for our art. Try to remove things that can be sources of background noise when you're recording an interview or recording voiceover. It will make a big difference later on. It will mean that potentially you don't need to get into some of the fancier noise removal techniques that I'll touch on at the end of this talk, because you spent some time at the beginning making sure that things sound good. The other kind of like main category of things to think about is looking at reflected sound, right, or echo. Most of us live in rooms that have a lot of reflective surfaces, right, like an untreated wall, something like that. Sound bounces off that, it comes back, it hits your microphone, and it can make your sound a little muddier, a little less professional. And so we want to try to get rid of this like nasty reflected sound. So there are a couple of different ways to do that, right? The most complete solution would be to encase yourself in a room of sound attenuating foam, so that there's no reflection at all. Every stray, sound wave is absorbed by your environment. But obviously nobody lives in that world, especially in COVID, right? When most of us are working from home and don't have access even necessarily to the normal recording environments that we might be used to. That doesn't mean that you can't make a home recording studio. This is just a picture I pulled from Google. You can buy sound attenuating foam panels. They're actually not that expensive, and you can do a thing called treating a room, right? Treating it for reflected sound. So basically removing that excess sound just by applying. Okay, my cat has just decided to knock over a big stack of boxes. I apologize. So you can treat a room with sound attenuating foam. It's a little expensive, but it's not entirely outside the realm of somebody who's, like a professional working from home, or even an amateur with a sufficient budget. But sound attenuating foam isn't the only way to get rid of reflective sound, right? A lot of people have a room in their house that is actually probably full of soft materials called a closet. Even such storied names as NPR's Ira Glass, it turns out during the pandemic, thought that it was fine enough to record in a closet where things like your hanging clothes are going to interrupt some of that reflected sound and just reduce the echo that might be present in an environment. I love this photo so much, not least of which because like Ira Glass is clearly at home, just chilling, and he's wearing a full suit, full on suit, no shoes. So question mark there, but full suit, which is that professional podcast energy that I'm sure we would all love to bring to the table. But even if you can't do that, right, a super simple solution, something really easy, just put something behind your mic, right? In this case, a couple of pillows, something soft, blankets, to try to reduce the reflected sound that's coming out. Just anything that you can do to kind of make your input sound easier, such that you can make even a pretty cheap sounding mic sound pretty good. So with that said about the environment, we can move on to kind of like the exciting, the world of actually capturing audio with something like a microphone. So this is a photo by our wonderful photography team from an interview that we did pre-COVID, kind of like showing what a real life interview setup often looks like, which is this room isn't treated, right? We've done our best to try to reduce noise, and I'm going to be talking about all the individual components you can see, but it's a mess, right? There's cables everywhere. It doesn't have to look pretty. It only needs to sound good. So I'll be discussing, I've just arbitrarily made this taxonomy of mics going from what I'm calling basic through enthusiast and up to professional. And this goes right off the screen because there is really no upper limit to the amount of money that you can spend on a mic. It just goes on forever. So we've got our mics here, but there's a whole bunch, a whole spectrum of microphones ranging from basic to professional that you can think about when you're producing your podcast, right? I think the microphone that probably now in the era of Zoom is some kind of, webcam, either a standalone webcam that you attach to your computer, or even just a laptop's built-in webcam will have a microphone as part of that. In general, throughout this talk, we're going to try to figure out ways to get away from that microphone because aside from like really, really high-end webcam mics tend to suck. They tend to be really bad. They tend to make your recordings bad. And even if you treat your room and do everything else you can, if you're using a webcam mic, you're not going to have the kind of professional sound that might make you happy, obviously. And this is like an important thing to state up front. These tools should always be in the service of a story, right? Your first job when making a podcast is to tell a story. And the microphones come second. So if what you have is a webcam and you're like, I really want to make a show, but I don't have the money to buy a nicer mic, just make the show and figure out how to make it sound good later. But with that said, if you're going to spend a little bit of money, trying to upgrade from something like a webcam mic can be really important, or something like if you have an old rock band set, maybe don't use that microphone. I've tried, it's trash. I'm putting phones here, not because they're cheap. Obviously, they're much more expensive than this. But this is an aspect that a few people have touched on earlier in the day. Both I think Tanya and Jeremy touched on this. That phones actually represent a pretty interesting. The microphones that are present on today's smartphones are actually decently high quality. They punch above their weight in terms of what you might expect from a thing that's in your pocket that you can carry around with you all the time. And a little later in this talk, we're gonna discuss ways that you can creatively use a phone to capture audio in a situation where you might not have any other options and still get a decent sounding product at the other side. From there, we move into kind of like what I'm calling sort of the enthusiast range, the sort of like mid $100 to like mid $300 range. Again, obviously, this can be prohibitive for some people starting out. I encourage you to check out Nathan and Jan's session tomorrow at 3:35, which is going to talk about budgeting for your podcast, setting aside some money so that hopefully you can afford some quality equipment. It doesn't take a lot, but it does take probably a couple of $100s to get yourself set up with the infrastructure you need. So I'm going to share these slides once this presentation is done, but I'm just sharing the names and prices of some of the mics that we're sort of discussing. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about each of these specific mics, but I'm hoping you can use this document as a reference when you're sort of like looking for what kind of mics to get. And there are two that I'll shout out really briefly. The first is the Shure SM58. This is a mic that we use a lot in Raw Talk. These two mics are the ones that do the bulk of the work for Raw Talk. If you've listened to our episodes, if you haven't, it doesn't matter. Like our episodes sound decent. They don't sound like studio quality, incredible, products, but they nonetheless have like a pretty professional sound. And that comes off some fairly cheap mics. And again, it's like I said, because we're treating our environment correctly, and we're doing a few other tricks that you can use to make a relatively cheap sounding mic or cheap mic sound like a more expensive mic. Obviously, the other shout out here is the Blue Yeti. This is a digital mic as opposed to an analog one, and I'll get into what that means in a second. But the Blue Yeti is probably like the single most used like podcasting mic, both because it represents like this good convergence of like it's decently cheap so that individual enthusiasts can buy it, and it produces like a decent quality sound. Again, with the Shure SM58 and the Blue Yeti, these are not like top quality mics. Like if I'm not recommending to you is like the ultimate mic that you should be looking for, the final form of your recording setup, but these are really good for the value that they offer. The other thing I'll say about the SM58 in particular, again, it isn't the best sound, but these things can take a beating. So if you're in an interview environment, like, hopefully post-COVID when we can actually go out into the world again, there's something to be said for a mic that you can drop and that will recover well. As you get into the more expensive and fancy mics, right, you have to treat them like a $500, $600 object. The SM58 will take an absolute beating. The other three mics that I put here are specifically because I actually talked to Jeremy Bloom prior to this talk and asked him, if you're a podcaster starting out and I was asking you like for a mic recommendation, what would you tell me? And these are the three that he talked about. So you can look these up on your own, but they represent, Jeremy Bloom's a professional. So I certainly trust him. The MV7 is definitely like another mic that a lot of podcasters use if they have money to spend on it. And the MV88 Plus is actually really interesting because it plugs into your phone. So it turns your phone into essentially like a pretty high quality, on the go recorder. So again, it's another thing to consider if you're looking to produce sound on the fly. So with that said, oh God, I've just been informed that, yeah, I'm definitely got to keep an eye on time. I forgot that I started late. So I was like, I'm just taking along just fine. We're going to go a little bit over. I'm going to try to move fast through this. Analog versus digital mics. This is something that you should definitely think about. I'll go pretty quick through this, and then hopefully the slides will be able to answer any further questions that you have. But you should consider the environment that you're in. Right? Ask yourself, am I going to be interviewing people out in the field, or am I going to be mostly sitting at home in front of a computer? If you're sitting at home in front of a computer, then a digital mic can be a great choice. They interface directly with a PC or a Mac, and they can, produce some really high quality sound. By contrast, an analog mic usually requires some kind of converter to transmit signals that it receives into actual like data that you can actually use. So if you're sitting in front of a computer all the time, a digital mic is great. The problem is that if you're out in the field, right, if you're recording guests, as we often do, it can be difficult even to lug a laptop around and set it up all the time. In general, it's easier if you have an analog mic and some other equipment that we're going to talk about a little bit later. With that, you can actually produce some pretty high quality sound. So if you're going to be on the move a lot, doing interviews all over the place, consider getting an analog mic and an analog digital converter. And then quality and price kind of go together. Digital mics tend to be targeted. This isn't exclusively true, but you can find a lot of sort of like enthusiast level. These are like for things like streamers and podcasters. Mics that sit in the couple $100 range have decent quality at a moderate price. And again, that can often be enough if what you're trying to do is record your voice and, you know, you talking to some friends, that can be entirely enough. And then if you're looking for something that's on a little, a higher end sort of model, those tend to be analog mics and are going to require, you know, fancy interfaces and stuff. So it's something to consider when you're thinking about budget. The sort of main takeaway that I want to stress from these two slides, the price slide and this one, is to think about what your needs actually are, right? Consider what your podcast is going to be and what you need. If you're going to be in front of a computer recording voiceover, work to tell a story, something like a Blue Yeti or a comparable like digital enthusiast level microphone could be sufficient for what you want. If you're going to be out in the field, you might want to consider something analog. But again, what I'd really recommend is actually, instead of blowing your budget on a microphone, I would say if you're out in the field, do this. Save some money and put it aside for something like a field recorder. So a couple of people today have talked about the Zoom, which is like a great field recorder that can be used to sort of like collect signals when you're out in the field. You can plug in an SM58 or something else like that into this recorder, and then you can take this wherever you go. So, you know, Jeremy Boone was talking about recording sounds out in your environment, or even recording a guest. Something like a Zoom field recorder is a great choice. This is kind of like the lowest price point that exists, sort of for a good quality field recorder. The next level up is kind of like $1,000. And unfortunately, like in between those two price breaks, there isn't really anything. So that's why I'm saying, if you have a limited budget, it might be worth, instead of splurging on a mic, going for a cheaper mic and going for something like a field recorder if you're going to be in a situation where you're performing interviews. Because these two things together also allow you to transfer your data like directly onto your computer. So you can do your voiceover work with a cheap analog mic and a field recorder instead of buying like a potentially fancier mic. The other thing to think about is stands and arms, right? Basically anything that separates your microphone from the table or floor is fantastic. Please, 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 I beg of you. This is a personal me begging you, don't let your guests hold their microphones in their hands, because guests mean well, but they kind of like shift their hands around and that moves the cable around and that introduces noise, which becomes extremely hard to remove when you're trying to edit into a professional sounding final podcast. So get even just a simple stand or some kind of a boom arm so that the microphone is held on its own. Nobody needs to touch it and it just hangs out there in the air collecting the sound for you. So yeah, these kind of like accessories can be really important in producing a good quality sound. And for the most part, aside from the field recorder, they don't necessarily need to be very expensive. So yeah, we're going to go a little bit over time because this is something that I really want to talk about, because I think it impacts a lot of people today, and that's remote recording, right? In an age where we no longer can go to our guest and just collect audio from them directly, we're faced with this problem where you want to get the best quality audio that you can from a remote guest, but you've got crappy mics and bad internet on their side, potentially. We're going to make a few assumptions, right? Which is that you followed my advice from the previous slides. You've got a good mic, you're in a good room, and you've got a good internet connection, and you're collecting your signal locally, meaning it's not going over the internet. It's going directly into a recorder, and you're going to use that signal. Then the issue is you have a guest who's on Zoom or something else, and so they're sending their audio signal, which is probably coming from their crappy webcam mic, over the internet, which might also be crappy to you. And so you've got these two things, crappy mics and bad internet, which are going to get together and potentially sabotage an otherwise great recording with some like, you know, distracting audio that your listeners are not going to like. And so what we're going to do to try to avoid that issue is to try to get the best local recording that you can. So what I mean by a local recording is, instead of your guest sending their information over the internet to you in real time, you guys might still be chatting on Zoom, but what we're going to introduce is another microphone on their end that's collecting their voice directly. They're going to record that, and then they'll send the file to you later. And so this is a situation where a smartphone can come in really handy, because we play around with a number of these, a number of possible solutions to this issue over the past months. We've like thought about mailing professional mics to guests, but it gets complicated because a guest doesn't necessarily know how to set up like a good recording environment. So we're trying to find something that is actually usable, right? That people can actually use out in the real world, but that also serves this role of providing you with the best local recording you can get. So like I said, a smartphone, a microphone on your phone is actually great. So what we're encouraging our guests to do is just take their phone out, get their recorder app, put their phone on like a stack of books or like a towel or something, just to isolate it from the ground so you don't get that table noise. And then do the same interview that we would do with them over Zoom, but get them to be also recording on their phone. And then after the interview is over, we get the guest to send their audio from their phone to us. And what we found is that although it's not a perfect solution, and although it doesn't work every time, having the second option of a local recording on a phone can really improve the quality of your audio over something that's like just collecting, sound directly from Zoom, which I think we've all at some point or another experienced problems where it becomes really frustrating to work without audio later. And again, one of the goals here is we're trying to simplify and improve the signal that we collect as much as possible, so that when we get into editing and post-processing, we don't have to worry about the sort of like nasty issues that come with a bad recording. And instead we can focus on producing the best quality sound. And it also means that we don't necessarily need to use the most expensive tools. So I'm gonna skip over like a brief slide I had here on synchronization. If you guys have questions about syncing remote recordings, we can talk about it in the discussion. But I'll move on to sort of talking about processing your audio. So this is once you've collected the signal, what are you going to do with it? And we're basically going to be talking about potential software options, because I think this is a question that a lot of people starting out have, is what's the right software to use? And if there's a theme emerging from this talk, it's that figure out what your needs are first, and then the right answer can stem from that. So Audacity, as was mentioned earlier, is great because it's free. It's free and open source, which means a lot of people have developed for it, and it has actually a lot of really powerful functionality. It has some really good noise removal tools. It has all kinds of plugins that you can explore. Unfortunately, that often can come at the cost of ease of use. I know some people who are really, really adept that amaze me with their ability to use Audacity because they figured out all the shortcuts and submenus and stuff. I have always found it a little bit frustrating when you're just doing something like you're just trying to comp together this clip and that clip, but you just want to put them in order. I find Audacity to be a little tough for doing that. It isn't quite as fluid as some other softwares that we're going to be looking at, but that's entirely because I haven't spent the time necessarily to learn Audacity. So if you're in a situation where you just don't have money, Audacity can be a great free tool, which is really powerful. If you have a little bit more money to spend, Hindenburg is a great option. So yeah, for the first 4 seasons of Raw Talk, we used the $125 base version of Hindenburg Journalist, as Richie was mentioning. And it has a decent set of features for cutting together a podcast. Like, again, this podcast was built, like the following that we have now was built on episodes that were made in Hindenburg Journalist. It's $125. And the other thing is this isn't like a recurring subscription model. So you pay $125 once and you have the license, which means if you get a grant, this can be a great thing to spend it on, because you know that cost isn't going to come back to you again and again. It has a decent set of features. It's quite easy to use and looks nice and has a nice UI. The reason that we ultimately transitioned away from Hindenburg Journalist, and partially this is just like a product of like my personality and the way that I am, is that although it has a suite of pretty decent features, it assumes a bunch of defaults for you. It says, we think that you're going to want to do this, that, and the other with your podcast. And if you want to break outside of that mold or do anything a little different, it can be quite challenging with Hindenburg. There's one way to do it. And if it's not Hindenburg's way, it's kind of the highway a little bit, especially for things like noise removal. So if you're in a situation like that, where you have sort of more complex audio you're dealing with, something like Adobe Audition can be a good choice. Obviously, it can get pretty prohibitive. $300 a year can be a lot for somebody starting out. So it's absolutely something to keep in mind. I hesitate to offer, to give this option to people, just because I know that it can be really hard to find $300 a year to spend. But for that cost, you do get a lot of features, specifically in like noise and like errant sound removal. I found Audition to be like really amazing, like very impressive, the kinds of things that it can do. And they're releasing new features for it all the time, blah, blah, blah. It's decently easy to use. It's like, I think Richie called it like the Photoshop of audio. And I think that's a really good analogy, because Photoshop is super powerful and there's a lot you can do with it. And it's decently easy to use once you kind of like figure out where everything is in the menus. And similarly, Audition does have a learning curve, once you overcome that learning curve, it can be a really powerful tool for sort of like high-end, problems that require more complicated solutions. As well, we were able to figure out some automation stuff in Audition, which has really saved me and the team a lot of time as we're putting together our episodes. But again, I'll maybe if you guys have questions about that, I'll leave it for the discussion time. A couple of other honorable mentions are GarageBand and Logic Pro, which are both for Mac, so I don't really have a lot of experience with them. I'm a PC guy. I think that GarageBand is really nothing to sneeze at, though. It's freeware. It's really great. And it's pretty user friendly. So it kind of straddles the line between Hindenburg and Audacity in that it's free and it has a decent feature set while remaining pretty easy to use. Logic Pro is another thing that people have talked to me about. It's like the big brother of GarageBand. Super, super powerful audio editing program. Not necessarily always suited for podcasting in my experience. There are kind of some weird end arounds that make a lot of sense when you're doing music production, but for podcast editing, just introduce another step that could be frustrating. But if you have Logic for something else, if you're producing music, for example, you can absolutely edit a podcast in Logic and use some of its powerful tools for things like noise reduction as well. So I'll leave it there for the most part. The things that we talked about were recording voice, and the main takeaway, if you learn anything from this, is to start simple by treating your room, right? Think about your environment and things that you can do for a very low cost that will improve your sound. And then pick the right mic for the job. I think Jeremy Bloom had this amazing quote. He said, "The best knife doesn't make the best meal," which is way better than I could have ever said it. Don't necessarily go for the most expensive gear you can. Think instead about what your application is. Do you need to be just at a computer? Something in a case like that, you're just recording your own voice. An enthusiast level digital mic might be right for you. If you're out in the field but you don't have much money, get a cheap mic, get a Shure SM58, get a Zoom field recorder, and go out and collect audio and be confident that although it might not be perfect, it will be good. And the most important thing, right, is to tell a story first, not to have perfect audio first. And then in terms of software for editing, find a combination of pricing features that works for you, right? So figure out what your price point is. And again, if you clean up your recordings at the acquisition step, you can potentially use a pretty simple program to edit it and be in good shape. So with that, I'll say thanks. I don't know. I think that instead of doing questions in the chat, I'm just going to post a link over to the discussion section, which should be live very shortly for audio engineering. So we have a whole host of these sessions that are going to go live in a minute. So I'd encourage you to head over into the sessions tab and take a look at what topics interest you. Find one that's interesting, just hop in and chat with some Raw Talk people and some other attendees of the conference. And hopefully we can get some interesting discussions going. I'll plug my own discussion room, which is here. I'll pin it as well. So if you guys are interested in asking questions about audio engineering, I'm going to go hang out in that room, and then hopefully you can come and ask me questions. But thanks so much for your time. This kind of concludes the end of the main stage events for today. So thanks for sticking around.